The American people were very divided in their opinion of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of Americans were isolationists, and as such, they wanted to do everything to stay out of war. And even after Hitler took over in 1933, they still felt that it was possible that the Atlantic Ocean could provide a buffer so that we would not have to get into the war. And the real challenge to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who recognized the danger, was to try to see whether he could change public opinion. But in 1935, the Congress, which was very isolationist, passed the Neutrality Act, which prevented shipments to people that we considered our friends and opponents of Germany, particularly England. And the Neutrality Act hampered Roosevelt's efforts. But it took Pearl Harbor really to change the American people's attitude, not only toward Japan, but toward Germany, to recognize that this was a threat. I got involved primarily in July of 1942 because I was drafted. I was drafted into the infantry and sent to Camp Croft, South Carolina, which is right near Spartanburg, South Carolina, amid all the mosquitoes and red mud and heat and humidity of a hot summer in South Carolina, which is very debilitating. All of us at Camp Croft were determined to do anything to get out of the infantry. We thought this would be a terrible place to spend the war. That would be the first one to be killed or wounded. And so we kept asking our training officers about possibilities, and they all said, well, why don't you apply for officer candidate school? You can apply for any officer candidate school that you want to. And so we all got together and decided where would be a good safe place to spend the war. We figured coast artillery. Surely the Germans could not fire across the Atlantic to the coast, so that would be a good place to apply. So we all put in applications for Coast Artillery Officer Candidate School. And the Army has a way of handling people that they call malingerers. And so they sent 100% of those of us who had applied for Coast Artillery to Fort Knox, Kentucky to become tank commanders. And, that was worse. And so I just had a very lucky break. I was always singing and playing music, and everybody recognized that I was musically inclined. And so about 2 weeks before we completed officer candidate school, this was in February of 1943, I was called out of ranks one day and told that I was ordered to write and choreograph a musical show for the big brass that was coming in from the Pentagon in a week. And this was a real challenge to me because I hadn't had any experience, but there's a World War II song called Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition. And I wrote a parody on that called Praise the Lord and Pass Me My Commission. And we had in the officer candidate school singers and actors who had already performed on Broadway. They were professionals. They were part of the officer candidate class, and they took this parody that I'd written and they ad-libbed a lot of funny things that had happened during our training. We had one officer who could imitate the training officers and their idiosyncrasies, and it was hilarious. And they put on one of the most wonderful shows. I had to do very little except just to tell them what to do next, and they did it so beautifully that the commanding general of the Armored Force School, a brigadier general named Stephen Henry, called me in and he said, you know, that was the most remarkable show I've ever attended. He said, it really ought to be playing on Broadway, it's so good. And he said, you should be doing something more important than just driving a tank in the war. And he said, we're going to send you to the European Theater of Operations, and we're going to make you a combat historian. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, we'll give you a Jeep, and you'll drive up and down the front lines, and you'll get the in-depth story of all the critical actions along the front line. And this is not to benefit the Army, but he said this is in order to provide lessons learned for West Point and Command and General Staff College and other training institutions. And that was a wonderful opportunity to be part of the action. We carried guns, we captured prisoners, and we shot at the enemy, but I never killed anybody, I'm sure. And so that was how I got involved in the war. Well, first of all, I'll tell you the positive, then I'll tell you the negative. The positive is that General Patton always believed that the way to avoid casualties was to move fast, and he would instruct the troops. I was part of the Patton's army to, if you meet resistance, bypass it. Let somebody else back of you clean it up. Keep going east toward Berlin. That's the positive. Now the negative about Patton is that he was resented by many of his soldiers because he was what we call a spit and polish man. In other words, in the heat of combat, he insisted that people's shoes be signed, and they immediately salute when they see a senior officer. And I ran afoul of that because when I landed in Normandy, by that time I'd been promoted to captain. Promotions came very fast in combat. And during 1944, I was a captain. And it was a policy of the German army to put snipers out to shoot officers. So I wanted to avoid being shown as an officer, so there's a sticky substance called cosmoline, which I put over the insignia of my helmet to hide the fact that I was an officer. I didn't want to get sniped at by a German sniper. And one day, General Patton came into our camp, and he was a lieutenant general at the time, and he had 3 stars on his helmet. They were shining like diamonds. He had no cosmoline on them. He had a big red flag on his Jeep with 3 stars. all over his Jeep you could see, General, General, General. And he was down there, and he looked over at me about 50 feet away, and I could tell he was getting madder and madder when he saw I had Cosmoline, and he says, "Come over here, God damn it!" And he said, "Are you proud of your goddamn rank?" And I said, yes, sir. My legs were shaking. And he proceeded to chew me out for, to me, seemed like about half an hour. It was probably no more than 5-10 minutes, but I learned some new swear words. And so the conclusion of his tirade was, if you don't take that damn stuff off your helmet, I'll take your damn rank away from you right here and now. So, of course, I took it off, but when he left camp, I put it back on again because I didn't want to get sniped at. So he was a great general, but so far as little things like that, why, he was insufferable. On the 7th of March, 1945, we had already penetrated the western part of Germany. There's a strip of land about 40 miles wide known as the Rhineland, which comes between the Rhine River and the French border. And we were going east toward the Rhine River. Adolf Hitler had issued an order to blow up all the bridges along the Rhine so that we couldn't cross the Rhine with dry feet. But when we got to the Rhine River, I was not with the first troops. I was about 10 miles back. But the electrifying news came in that we had captured this bridge at a little town called Remagen, about halfway between Cologne and Koblenz, Germany. So I hightailed down there immediately with a bunch of notebooks to find out what had happened, since to me this was the most critical action, and I had a chance to interview all of the first troops that crossed the bridge. And what they do in the Army if you have an operation like that is they call back into reserve the very first combat troops and they replace them with fresh troops. So the soldiers that made the initial crossing of the bridge under fire and with the full knowledge that the Germans were trying to blow up the bridge while they were on it, they were men of courage. And I had a chance to interview them right on the spot because they had nothing else to do. We had captured a wine cellar and they had nothing to do but drink wine and talk with me about their exploits. Now in combat, a person 10 feet away from another person sees things a little bit differently. So to have all these people together, to have them check on each other, made it a very accurate story. It was so important because if we had not captured that bridge, it means that we would have had to make an assault crossing under machine gun fire and suffered perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 casualties. But we were able to cross the bridge, cross the Rhine, and it was psychologically a tremendous inspiration to everybody in the American Army, and a terrible blow. And Adolf Hitler made a statement that this was worse than the Normandy invasion, and he pretty well decided that this could only have happened through treason in the German army. And so we sent an execution squad down, and they picked out 5 officers and sentenced them all to death. 4 of the 5 were immediately executed. The 5th man was never executed because we captured him, and that saved his life. And I went back to Germany after the war and discovered how to locate this man, and he came back to Remagen, and we spent a whole week going over the ground of the German defenses. And this was so important because it meant that we could encircle all the German troops along the Rhine. We encircled about 300,000, which you got to surrender. And this happened March 7, 1945, and the war was over in Europe May the 8th, so it was a direct contributing factor to ending the war in Europe on May 8th, 1945, as well as saving 5,000 to 10,000 lives. And it was a wonderful example of courage and initiative on the part of the first troops. They had no plans, you see. It was not ordinarily when you're in an attack mood, you plan it very carefully how you're going to do it, but this was a sudden surprise that fell into our laps, and that all these reasons is why it's important. Well, after the end of the war on May 8th, 1945, our main job was to round up as many German prisoners as we could. And this was very fortunate because most of the Germans who had been in the army fighting against us did not want to be captured by the Russians. They'd much rather be captured by the Americans because they knew the Russians would probably immediately execute them. And so Herman Goring, who was the number 2 man to Adolf Hitler, Hitler was holed up in Berlin, and he intended to stay there. And Goring left. Goring didn't want to get captured by the Russians. And so when he left, Hitler immediately issued an order that he had deserted and should be shot. And so the people that were sent to shoot him had been working for him, and they told him about the order, and they said, "We're not going to carry it out, but you ought to be aware that you're a hunted man." And so Goring decided that he was going to give himself up, and he was wined and dined by the people that captured him because they considered him a real icon, which he was. And when that news came up to Eisenhower, Eisenhower said he's a war criminal and should be treated like a criminal. And so they sent him, along with a lot of other top Nazis that had been captured, up to a prisoner of war camp in Luxembourg. And along about a month after he was captured, I was working on writing up the history of World War II, and the people at the Pentagon here in this country said, wouldn't it be a good idea to get some experts in to get the news from the top-ranking Nazis as to how they had planned the war. And so they sent a 5-member commission over. 4 of the members were to be investigating the system of justice, the economy, how Hitler's headquarters operated. And the 5th man was to concentrate on military operations. And so when they got to Paris and they called on the combat history group to try to get a person who had knowledge of history to join this 5-member commission, and I was finally designated to go to Luxembourg, and that's how I got involved. And I don't use the word interrogate because I'd rather use the word interview, because I tried to demonstrate both to Goring and the other Nazis that I talked with that I was not the least bit interested in war crimes or the Holocaust, that I was just interested in military operations, like how the Battle of the Bulge was planned and what kind of defenses they had in Normandy and things like that. So that's how I lucked into that assignment in mid-July of 1945. I was sent up to Luxembourg and told, get what you can in a week and come on back and do your major job of completing the writing of the history. But I soon found that a week was not long enough, and I sent back the results of some of my interviews, and I was told, well, these are so good that you stay there as long as you think it's necessary, which I did. Well, he's a very arrogant person, and he was difficult to slow down. In other words, he had a story to tell, and it was very difficult to get him to stick to the question. His nickname among the guards was Fat Stuff, which is very appropriate because he was overweight. And when I asked the first day I got there to interview Goring, well, one of the guards, I heard him yell down the hall, "Send up Fat Stuff to Major Hechler." And somebody else would yell down the hall, "Send up Fat Stuff to Major Hechler," just like you'd order 2 fried eggs, sunny side up, and a hash joint. And he strode into the room and he clicked his heels and said, "Goring, Reichsmarschall." And so before I could even ask him a question, why, he asked me a question. He said, "Do you know General Eisenhower?" And of course I said, yeah. He said, "Can you get a message to General Eisenhower?" And I said, "Sure, tomorrow morning I'll get a message to him. And what should I say?" And he said, "You tell General Eisenhower that here in this prisoner of war enclosure we have the head of the Wehrmacht, the German army, Field Marshal Keitel. We have the head of the German Navy, Admiral Dürnitz and his submarines." Then he pounded his chest and said, "And I am the commander of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force." He said, "You tell General Eisenhower that I will mobilize the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force of Germany. We'll team up with the Americans, we'll beat hell out of the Russians, and you won't have any problems in this world from now on." And of course I never forwarded that message, which was crazy. But he felt that he could forge an alliance with the Americans, but he did give me some very interesting, fascinating military information. I'll give you one example. Are you aware of the fact that General Patton got into trouble by slapping two American soldiers who were in the hospital because of combat fatigue? He said there is no such thing as combat fatigue, and he said to the nurses, he said, get these men back on the front lines. There's nothing wrong with them, they just they're just cowards. Well, when that happened, why, General Eisenhower told Patton on June 6, 1944, he didn't use that date, but he said, when we invade Normandy, you're not going to be part of the operation. And so they stationed him in the town of Dover, which is right opposite Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. And he paraded around so that all the German spies could see where he was. And Goring said they brought back the word to hear America's most able, prominent general wouldn't be up at Dover unless he was going to lead the invasion from Dover instead of Omaha Beach, where it really occurred. And so Hitler, as a result of that, kept about 15 or 20 divisions opposite Dover, figuring that even after we invaded Normandy, that was just a diversionary effort, that the main effort was going to come with Patton leading it across the English Channel. And so Patton served a very useful purpose as a decoy. But those were a couple of the things that happened when I talked with Goring. When I went back to Germany to get the material for my book, The Bridge at Remagen, I interviewed a lot of enlisted personnel, but these were primarily the top officers because I knew a lot of them were going to be tried at Nuremberg, and I wanted to make sure that I talked with them before they went on trial. But I had to convince them I wasn't interested in any of the terrible things they had done, just the military operation. Well, there was a difference of opinion. I mean, it was about 50-50. Some of them realized what was going on, and others that I interviewed were part of the plot to try to kill Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944. Well, the colonel who placed the bomb in his briefcase and then excused himself, he had it placed in a way that would have killed Hitler. But what happened was that this was a table with very thick oaken legs, and one of the generals, the briefcase was in his way, so he kicked it over behind one of the supports for the table, and this absorbed some of the force of the bomb. And I think there were 3 generals that were killed, but and Hitler suffered a broken eardrum and was never quite the same after that. But it was the Stauffenberg, when he saw the explosion, he felt everybody had been killed. He called up Berlin, told his rebel assistants to take over, and a few minutes later they got a call from Hitler saying, as soon as this guy gets off the plane, why, stringing him up and executing, which they did. Yes, I think it was necessary because despite the escape of 300,000 troops at Dunkirk, why Hitler was poised to invade England, and had he conquered England, the rest of Europe would have fallen. He already had control of France, but I think he was a madman who simply had to be stopped by military force in no other way other than the attempts to assassinate him that we could have. So I think the war was necessary.